So Father Ron has very generous introductions. I don't know if I'm a theologian so much. The last time he introduced me, he called me a right-brained theologian, and I think that's more apt. Because I'm not an academic, and I'm probably closer to the poet category, sort of telling truth in slant. And today, my presentation, I'll be speaking quite a bit and playing, but my presentation is so not out there that for some of you it might be out there. Because I'm going to be dancing with bringing us back down to earth, our home, where we live. And as most of us we come from the Christian tradition, there has been quite a hyper focus on not being from here and heading somewhere else. And as Wendell Berry said in his great essay, The Native Hill, what the indigenous people observed when the Europeans first came here was because they hadn't acclimatized their hearts and their spirits to place, they felt they could abuse the abundance that was here. And they felt they could just slaughter hickory trees and build massive fires instead of building a fire that would keep them warm that was enough. And so Wendell Berry has actually become, he has for a long time really been an influence on my life. He's a poet and he's a farmer, and I would call him a right-brained theologian as well. And as he aged, he became quite curmudgeonly, and I think I am as well. On our farm, we have, so I'll back up a little bit to say that my husband and I, over the last 8 years, have been sort of building towards, we're both artists, so we have to get very creative around our living situation. We began with, before we had kids, we built a tiny house in Alberta when we were still living there. And we lived in the woods on his employer's property, rent-free for 2 years. And I actually hauled my grandma's old wood stove from Manitoba and set it up in this tiny house, and we had to get up in the middle of the night to feed the fire because it's very cold in the wintertime there. And we also lived without plumbing, so we had to pilgrimage to a shop bathroom, and like the shower, it wasn't as heated as we would have wanted, and we had an outhouse. And so over that span of time, we built up enough to invest in a little property that was along a lake outside of Edmonton, and we basically turned this cabin into what would be called a small house today. And it was just really, most people would have just pushed it over, and we converted it into this sort of beautiful space. And with both of those projects, the tiny house was 95% salvaged material, and the small house was about 85%. And then we moved to Manitoba, which is a geography lesson here. So Alberta is in the prairies at the foothills of the Rockies. Saskatchewan, where Father Ron grew up, is between Alberta and Manitoba. And it's along this border that doesn't have a wall yet, but Canadians are joking around that we might build one out of beer bottles. And the joke is that it has to be good beer. So we moved 2 provinces over, still in the prairies, and onto a property that had a mobile home and a barn. and we had this vision of converting the barn into our home, and we lived in the mobile home from the 1970s for the last 2.5 years, and we've been working on this barn. And when we first moved into the mobile home, the first storm that came in, rain was shooting through the windows, and we had cleared all of these poplar, what we call suckers, that had grown up that were sort of encroaching on this mobile home, and we had cleared them out. And so we ran around grabbing them, and we set them up in front of the windows so the rain wouldn't get in. And then we had some tin on the property, so we made a new roof. And so we're very into salvage, and we've just finished our barn home, which is about 75% salvaged material. And I mean, we go to dumps, and like the feature wall was a dock that used to be on a lake. It's cedar, and so just to give you a little context of where we're at right now. But I'm going to back up into my childhood to set the context for the perspective that I have, because I grew up right by the national park where we live today. We're on the south side now, and I grew up on the east side of the park. It's called Riding Mountain National Park. And so I grew up partly being raised by the wilds. I was outside all the time. I grew up riding horses, and also grew up quite poor. And we had a very large garden, and also hunted, not for sport, but I had to help to process elk meat to prepare for the winter. So it's kind of, today it's my comfort food. And so I had this perspective of feeling very comfortable in wild spaces. And I still do today. It's sort of my comfort zone. So as I bring in some of the ideas today, I want you to know that I know if that wasn't your experience growing up, it's going to be significantly more difficult to approach feeling comfortable in nature or in wild spaces. But there's another vein, two other veins that I'll bring into my childhood. And one is that I grew up in a Christian environment. And I also grew up on the land. We had a little acreage that was adjacent to my uncle's farm. And on that land, there was a very large rock that was flat. And we called it the stargazing rock, as people do. But there were little hints that were dropped along the way for me as I started to perceive the Canadian story. And some of those hints were literal physical objects that we would find on the property. Arrowheads being one. My grandmother had a rock hammer as a door stopper on her screen door porch. And this was normal. Nobody thought anything of it. And I began to think about that. And I would go to that stargazing rock and would find objects. And so I knew, even though everybody said, my family said, this is 5 generations, nobody else has been here. There's sort of a blind spot in our thinking when we say that, when we're finding these artifacts of people who had lived there, or at least had migrated through there, and there were probably very precious places there, and I believe that rock was one of those places. And so as I grew up, I started to comprehend that storyline more and more and more. And I got involved with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is basically, it's been, I think, 12 years now in the making of gathering stories from people who had suffered in residential schools in Canada. And it happened here in America too. And I was very involved with the Anglican Church of Canada and sat with the bishop and sat with priests to be basically a story receiver. As someone who had gotten herself to the point where she could acknowledge her complicity and how I had benefited from this narrative in Canada. And I received stories from women in their 80s and 90s who had never told their story of abuse before. And when you receive these stories, something, if you're ready, something clicks inside of you, and you start to examine your tradition and some of the rotten fruit that has come out of it, and start asking these questions. Why? Why was that a part of this storyline? My connection to Jesus, my understanding of this tradition shouldn't bear that kind of of rotten fruit. It shouldn't express itself in that way. Why is it expressing itself in this way? And there was a point where I journeyed home. I was already touring a lot around the world at that time, and I had come to this point where I was wrestling very deeply with whether or not I could be a Christian when we had played mercenary for the government in the way that we had. And I laid on that rock, and I just held my arms out and sat in the paradox in a pretty deep way. And I realized that I had to carry both, that we have been smog, guarding all the treasure, responsible for all the sort of trade relations over the centuries, where conversion around the world was more about trade than it was about transformation. And I allowed that smog, if you know who I mean from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I allowed that to be a part of me. And then I also realized I can't leave this tradition because I'm also the hobbit that is a keeper of the jewel and the treasure trove that is there. So it's this paradox that I walk around with all the time. And I can't walk around not in that paradox, because the minute I step out of it, I'm either, Dan talked about last night this irrational hope. If I step out of that paradox, I have this irrational blind spot for the complicity of the Christian tradition in the abuses that have occurred over the span of centuries. And I also have to stay in that paradox because it's probably the most ironic thing in the history of the world that we are so complicit and yet our founder, or he didn't mean to found it, but that the one we follow was who he was. And so I want to examine the person of Jesus today within the context of some of the things we may have missed as we were focused more on trade than on transformation, and as we were focused on civilizing more than connecting. And so I want to ask those kinds of questions. What is the difference between wholesome and wholeness? And what is the difference between being civilized and civilizing, or being connected? And because when I look at the person of Jesus and hold that irony, what I see is someone very different. And that's why I can't leave. Dan was saying, why don't I leave? And last night, and I have asked that many, many times, and I can't. I think it's partly my job to hold that paradox and to carry the treasure trove, and also acknowledge that we have been the mercenary. So before I get really down to earth, I want to set the stage with the first song that is really acknowledging the cosmic realm and the cosmos and the universe. And just in case you think that I'm so down to earth and want to, just be here, that I don't acknowledge cosmology. So I thought I would set it up that way. Before there were bells to ring, there was a hum, a resonance that gathered and peaked and sang like a bowl for all time. In spacious emptiness, without form, we danced and we flowed in love. In love, and then our love overflowed. Ex nihilo, ex nihilo. This is the beautiful, dangerous way to have our being at this density. So we risk when we love, 'cause if we're living, one day we will die. All of this came from that emptiness, pressed into each particular form, manifested to touch and embrace, because love overflows. Ex nihilo, ex nihilo. There is no end to the love that's inside. What if letting it out is the fullness of life? To hear the call deep within from our great self-emptying lover. And to fail and to fall into those infinite arms where love condenses from stardust to blood, pulsing through every heartbeat, because love overflows. Ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. So the last time I was here, Father Ron said I wasn't getting paid if I didn't play this song. And so, and I think he emailed me and said the same thing. So this is my, it's not a hit, but it's a hit for Father Ron. And it actually fits quite well because, like I said, that last song was quite earthy because it's really an incarnate perspective. And then this one, the context in which this song was placed in that album, Behold, I Make All Things New, it happened right after a song about the shepherds in the the advent of the birth of Jesus, and I wanted to kind of talk about how all of this actually used to be the dust from the heart of a star. So it always comes full circle if you're willing to sort of close the loop. And that term, close the loop, is a permaculture term. I don't know if you've heard of that word, but it's definitely a word that's in my vocabulary as someone who's running a regenerative farm. The idea is that energetically, when you want to create symbiosis on a farm, you have to close the loop. Otherwise, the energy is dissipating out. And it's a beautiful concept of design. And this storyline of incarnation on Earth is cosmic as well. Scientifically, we are stardust. Stargazing brought us here to this young master's door, to discover we are stardust, one in God forevermore, one in God forevermore. from above and are not apart from love. We are born from above and are not apart from love. Are you a sing-along crowd? Do you want to try that? We are born from above and are not apart from love. We are born from above and are not apart from love. We were kings before we entered. Now we bend our knee. But he raises us to standing, brothers to the Prince of Peace, sisters to the Prince of Peace. We are born from above and are not apart from love. We are born from above and are not apart from love. We are born from above and are not apart from love. We are born from above and are not apart from love. So this is a song also for Father Ron. He doesn't know about it, but I was very deeply inspired by his book, The Holy Longing. I'm sure many of you were. And so last year when Ash Wednesday landed on Valentine's Day, I mean, like for, priests and speakers, it was just this beautiful. I mean, I just rest in the paradox. That's what I do. That's my job. And when paradox just sort of lands like this delicious plate for you, it's always wonderful. And you'll remember that same year that Easter Sunday landed on April Fool's Day. So I wrote it. I won't be playing that song, but I wrote a song called When Love Meets Dust for Ash Wednesday, and I wrote a song called Holy Fool for Easter Sunday. But I'm going to play When Love Meets Dust because I really used the Holy Longing as my inspiration for working with that paradox on Ash Wednesday. So the first verse is really for my sister Janice Joplin, and then the second verse is for Princess Diana, and the third is for Mother Teresa. My heart has made me a wild child. The fire it burns out of control. Don't give me rules. Don't say I must. I'm what happens when love meets dust. My heart has seen behind the walls of palaces and royal halls. 1 foot in mercy, still one in lust. I'm what happens when love meets dust. And there's a longing down inside, and this longing never dies. It can destroy or it can trust, but it's what happens when love meets dust. My heart's been emptied, filled by you. You flow through me and suffer with the heavy laden, with the untouched. You are what happens when love meets dust. And there's a longing down inside, and this longing never dies. It can destroy or it can trust, but it's what happens when love meets dust. You sow this flame inside of us. We are what happens when love meets dust. So last year I put out an album called Point Vierge, Thomas Merton's Journey in Song. And I put that album out wanting to really stand in a lineage. So I asked my friend and teacher, James Finley. Some of you might have seen him speak here before. And I'm actually going to get my water. Elemental. But James is a depth psychologist, and he's known for writing the book Merton's Palace of Nowhere. And he's also a core faculty member at the Center for Action and Contemplation, which is Richard Rohr's organization in Albuquerque. And I met James through my experience as a student at the Living School, which is the Center for Action and Contemplation School. And he ended up doing a talk in Kelowna, BC, and I happened to be in the area. And so we got talking, and I just played a few songs before he spoke, and he said, that was a really interesting experience for me, because I don't know if I've ever spoken to such a disarmed group of people, and that the music it's another language, and it gets our guards down a little bit. And so we ended up doing 2 projects together. The first one was called Sanctuary, Exploring the Healing Path, which really focuses on his life's work as a therapist who worked with people who wanted spirituality to be a part of their healing journey. And he's a trauma survivor himself. So it was a very, very beautiful project to do with him. I was also expecting my second at the time of recording it, so it was just a lot of alchemy. And the engineer for that project was dying of cancer when we made it. So there's just this deep beauty that came out of that. But the album that I did with him about Thomas Merton, I wanted to work with the Merton Legacy Trust, which I did for a year and a half, doing research, just reading and reading and reading. I'd always read, well, not always, but I'd read Merton for a long time, but not with the intention of getting into the story the way I did to prepare to compose for that project. And so I used, the whole project are his words, the whole project. I put music to his words and told his story through his words. And the main book that I used was called The Intimate Merton, which is a collection of his, very large collection of his journals. Even if you were going to publish a book of all of his writing, it would probably, this room wouldn't be big enough. But something that's drawn me to Thomas Merton for myself is as I was struggling with acknowledging myself as mercenary and holding that paradox of being a Christian and seeing the damage that had happened in my country to the indigenous people there. That was my my starting point for grieving. And what I saw with Thomas Merton was that he not only was a bridge builder for reaching back to the mystics, he was a bridge builder ecumenically, but he was also a bridge builder to the how not neat and tidy the storyline is. and he wasn't neat and tidy. He was embodied. He loved to be in nature and knew that there were messages there, and that he didn't feel alien entering into those spaces. And that resonates for me in a pretty big way. So I remember too that he kind of in the late 50s, he kind of got really interested with the Shakers. And I remember him writing, my God, at least they had the sense to dance. And so I love that about him, that he wasn't disembodied and not far off in some quasi-intergalactic reality. He was here and in the mess of it. And I think the way he got there was through that solitude, touching the heart of the world. And another way was through his own personal grief. And so I would like to play, this is a poem he wrote for his brother, John Paul, when his brother died in the war. And the imagery in this is so earth-based and so connected. And, I think what James Finley says in his spoken word for this part is he remembers, he said that Merton didn't see his monastic enclosure as a refuge from the violence of his brother's death. He stepped into it. And James Finley remembered, being this young novice coming in to complain about something. And Merton said to him, you didn't come here to breathe a rarefied air. You came here to basically become one with the suffering of the world. Otherwise, there's no, Otherwise, there's no justification for living in a place like this. And that, I think, is why we are so drawn to, I'm drawn to him for that reason. Sweet brother, if I do not weep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fast shall live like willows where you died. If in the heart I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where, in what desolate and smoky country lies your poor body lost and dead? And in one landscape of disaster, has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come in my labor, find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head. Or rather take my life and blood and buy yourself a better bed. Or take my breath and take my death and buy yourself a better rest. When all the men of war are shot and flags have fallen into dust, your cross and mine shall tell men still, Christ died on each for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring. The money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand, and buy you back to your own land. The silence of whose tears shall fall like bells upon your alien tomb. Hear them and call, they call you home. So as I mentioned, Merton liked to be in nature, and he would often say, "Why are you bringing your books and Bibles into the woods? Put them down, get out there, open yourself up." And I think there's an earth-based teacher named John Young who I love to read. He studies with the Bushman tribe in Africa, which is one of the closest indigenous tribes left in the world that sort of follows those original instructions in terms of the wellness of community. Because we like to focus on evolution, which I think is great. It's important. Dan talking about sort of the lizard brain and sort of our fight-flight reflexes, which get very heightened when you become a mother. I'm a bear, essentially. But there was also a lot of wisdom within these communities. We like to sort of be dualistic about it, I think, sometimes, in the sense that we see, we observe some of the practices and think of them as, primal or and not as civilized as us. But really, there was a lot of wisdom built into the survival of the community. For instance, if a hunter became the best, they had to no longer hunt. They had to step down and mentor. That is not a part of our culture. It's part of the non-generative aspect of our culture that I think is doing an immense amount of damage. Also, if you listen to teachers like the peacekeeper, Iroquois peacekeeper, Horan Lyons, who's been banging the drum for Turtle Island for 50 years at the UN and practically getting nowhere. The American Constitution was influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy, basically. And there just happened to be a few little items that got pulled out, like a group of elder women had veto rights on whether we went to war, for instance. Another one that got pulled out was if the leader of that time decided to go to war and the women didn't veto it, he had to become a common warrior. So if you think about these very strategic things that got pulled from the very foundations of the New World, and however there were aspects that were used, aspects of wisdom that had worked for a long time that were used, where 7 nations had come together in peace that were where it seemed impossible. So although I do think it's important for us to look at the fight or flight and evolution and see where when that gets applied to ideology, how dangerous it is. Like Dan's presentation last night, it was beautiful. It's also important not to see it's also important not to forget that there was great wisdom. Another one with the Bushman tribe, they dance. They dance out what they call the nails. Like if someone shot a nail of some words that shouldn't have been spoken, etc., they do a dance that in community with their children that shakes off. It's basically a dance of forgiveness. And so we might see, in like a film or something, this dance happening that's tribal with the drums and not think about the context, but often that's why dancing was happening. It was a way to embody forgiveness and to let the next day be a fresh day for the community. Another one is I got to know a man who was a Cree elder who was also a sacred clown for his community. And he would reenact some of the travesties in a sort of mock fashion, dressed up, that would get the laughter going so that the grief could come. So there's beautiful, beautiful pieces of wisdom that I feel all the first axial contemplative traditions kind of dropped, that I think we need to pick up and examine and look at and realize that maybe if we don't do that, our ancestors are just ghosts. And there's something always haunting us to try and make us more of a whole person. And so this next song, Merton is looking at the birds. And John Young, who studies with the Bushman tribe, he does this workshop, I guess you can call it, where he takes people who feel very uncomfortable in nature and brings them out and gets them to learn bird language, which basically means birds they know when someone walks into the forest and feels alien to that place, like they don't belong, like they're from somewhere else, that they're not from here, and they know if you're comfortable. And so he brings people out and gets them to sort of let the birds mirror them and read them, and they start to become more embodied and more whole as they go through the process of letting the birds say, hey, you're pretty awkward here. You actually are from here. And so this is a poem he wrote called, I called the song We Do Not Attend. I don't think that was the name, but. We face the morning as men of undaunted purpose. We know the time and we dictate the terms. We know what time it is. We know what time it is. We know what time it is. For the birds, there is not a time that they tell, but the virgin point between darkness and light, between non-being and being, non-being and being, non-being and being. So they wait, first the catbirds and cardinals, later the song, sparrows and wrens, last of all the doves and crows, the doves and crows, the doves and crows. Here is an unspeakable secret. Paradise is all around us. Paradise is all around us. Paradise is all around us. And we do not understand. We do not understand. We do not understand. Lights on, clocks ticking, thermostats working, stoves cooking. Wisdom, cries the dawn deacon. But we do not attend. We do not attend. We do not attend. Merton, sitting alone out in the woods, said, suddenly the silence is broken by the song of a bird, announcing the difference between heaven and hell. So I think another way we can tell that we are often disembodied and often in a far-off place, far away from planet Earth, which, if you look at what Wendell Berry said when I started, how when the Europeans came and the indigenous people observed how they could just clear-cut hickory forest for a big fire. and see that although the perspective was this is an abundant place, that was the indigenous perspective. It was about using what you needed. As Wendell Berry says, it's not about making a killing, it's about having enough. And to sort of make a killing of this hickory forest for this large fire is just a symbol to me of when we hold the philosophy, really, I mean, if we're hyper focused, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying don't focus on it, but if we're hyper focused on the ascension of Jesus, we have a very good possibility of behaving more like the people that came and clear-cut the hickory than we do of the people who lived in a state of abundance and gratitude for the place in which God placed them. So the focus being on Jesus, say, in the way he was human, versus just hyper-focusing on his ascension, is another thing I wanted to point out. I don't know if any of you have seen John Dominic Crossan's presentation on Jesus moving to Capernaum and how the disciples lived in these villages that were peppered across the coastline of the Sea of Galilee. And his research is indicating, I'm not saying it's set in stone, there's probably a lot of scholars in this room, but his research is indicating that the move was connected to how the Sea of Galilee was renamed Lake Tiberias, and how the villages were losing their way of life. The fishermen that were his friends were losing their way of life because the city of Tiberias had become a commercial trade center for the fish that were coming out of that Sea of Galilee. And that there's a very good chance that in all of the, I would say, nonviolent activism or anti-colonial positions that Jesus took, there's a very good chance that he was also a food sovereigntist, if you look at that move. And what I mean by that is there's a very large movement that's grassroots that's happening today, that's a food sovereignty movement. Because, again, if you can control food, there's a good chance that you can pretty much control everything. Food is really what reminds us that we are from here, because we require what is produced from here for our own bodily sustenance. And there's a book by a woman named Leah Penniman that was published by Chelsea Green Publishing, and it's called Farming While Black. And she is this incredible food activist who's also a farmer, who is looking at the history of land distribution and farming, and particularly the history of farming in the community of color, and how there is a deep heritage of agriculture that she is sort of bringing forth. And she's got a movement that's happening across America, and I know of other movements in Canada where that drastic inequality of land ownership and land use is a really huge part of the storyline. And so I highly recommend this book just for the history of it. It's called Farming While Black. And she's found she's very good friends with a songwriter I love named Taj Mahal, who is was also a farmer. And so the other thing, this is going to lead into the next Merton piece, is as we are afraid to be here and from here and embodied, we are also, this also makes us deeply afraid of making mistakes. And we spend our lives often just sort of elevated somewhere, not with our feet on the ground, I think in part because we're afraid of grieving, and we're afraid of mistakes and acknowledging our mistakes, because if we do, often we'll grieve if we do. So this is sort of a poem. It was called, the poem is called Strange Islands, and it's really, I look at it as the aftermath of the dark night of the soul. When if anybody is in AA in this room, they'll get it. There's that point where you reach, for me, I wasn't in AA, but I left the music business in 2010, and my whole identity was tied up in it, and there was no spirituality for leaving, or as I was mentioning last night, spirituality of quitting something. That's not in this culture. We don't quit. We try again, and we go hard or go home, and we win almost at any cost. And so for me to step out of that identity and not know what the future held was, it was really the moment when I realized I was beloved, even though I just had nothing left. And I think if we've made a mistake, that's the Felix culpa. It's that moment when you use that as a way to realize that you've got nothing in your hands, and yet you are just embraced in grace. And so when in the soul of the serene disciple, with no more fathers to imitate, poverty is a success. It is a small thing to say the roof is gone. He has not even a house. Stars as well as friends are angry with the noble ruin. Saints depart in several directions.
And being wrong and having to, say, Mel Copard get back on his feet and clean himself off and start over again, that is the better way to live. Because the fellow who never makes any mistakes is in terrible shape, see. So if there's anybody around here who never makes any mistakes, whatever, well, please go take a bath in some holy water or something. Because
maybe we'll start it over. So that was Merton's voice. I got permission to use. Maybe we'll turn it up a little bit and we'll try and get it right from the front. So it's really, it's nice to receive it.
And this is one of the things our Lord came to reveal. See? He came to make clear that human beings can be, especially when they are right, and especially when they are holy, and especially when they are good, they can be terrible. See? And it is better to be the kind of person that has still the capacity for making a few mistakes and being wrong and having to, say, our co-part get back on his feet and clean himself off and start over again, that is the better way to live. Because the fellow who never makes any mistakes is in terrible shape. See? So if there's anybody around here who never makes any mistakes whatever, well, please go take a bath in some holy water or something, because
be still, be still, be still, be still. There is no longer any need of comment. It was a lucky wind that blew away his halo with his cares. It was a lucky sea that drowned his reputation. I would like to invite Sister Addie Walker to join me. So there's this hymn found in Colossians 1. And also in Ephesians and I think Philippians. They're all very tied together, and I think they're quite tied to the first chapter of John. When I found out that they were hymns, for me that was pretty special. And I wanted to try and sort of do a modern take on it. And the minute I got into it, I was like, there's no way I can do this. I'm going to enlist the poets. When in doubt, enlist the poets. So what I did was I asked my friend Malcolm Guite. Some of you might know who he is. He's a sonnet writer from England. And a fella from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Scott Cairns, and this wild, long, red-headed beat poet named Joel McCarroll from Australia, and then one of my favorite poets and an elder to me is Lucy Shaw, who was editor for Madeleine L'Engle's books and is a great poet. So I gave them each a line from Colossians 1, and they just sort of ran with it. And you have a line called, your line is, in whom all things hold together. That's it. And I really want to sort of, again, make clear as I'm talking about earth-based being from here, all of that, I do also believe that this is infused and interwoven with the uncreated God. And so that's the context for this piece. So the line is, in whom all things hold together in whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together. Great.
Everything holds together. Everything. From stars that pierce the dark like living sparks, to secret seeds that open every spring. From spanning galaxies to spinning quarks, everything holds together and coheres, unfolding from the center whence it came. And now, that hidden heart of things appears. The firstborn of creation takes a name. And shall I see the one through whom I am? Shall I behold the one for whom I'm made? The light in light, the flame within the flame, icon to theo, image of my God. He comes like a child to bless my sight, that I might come to him for life and light.
In whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together.
And when we had invented death, had severed every soul from life, we made of these, our bodies, sepulchres. And as we wandered dying, dim, among the dying multitudes, he acquiesced to be interred in us. And when he had descended thus into our persons and the grave, he broke the limits, opening the grip. He shaped of every sepulcher a womb.
In whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together.
And this is he who takes all that he is and bestows it freely, gives meekly, takes infinite power and bows the knee. Have you ever seen God on the ground? Palms pressed to the floor, sweat dripping on the dirt, the cut and stretch of being human, a sacred shelter of presence, fullness of he, creator of kingdoms and galaxies, principalities, and every moment crafted through time. The divine, placed wholly in human flesh. The infinite, squashed down into finite. Lifting, like fitting 10,000 angels on top of a pen, like the entire ocean is poured into a pool, like the wine is running over, like it's bursting at the seams. The Christ, he is bursting at the seams.
In whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together.
Anticipating long stretches of nothingness, we plunged south into California on I-5, prepared to be bored, uninterested in the view, and a bit worried that we too may commit monotony. But then, over us, clouds contribute their lenticular magnitude to the two-dimensional, carved by winds into streamlined eagles or spacecraft or B-52s. I take sky photos through the windshield, admitting that in spite of anonymity, there is never nothing. Required to obey gravity, we occupy open space with substance, all of us, on the skin of the planet created to lift against the Earth's pull, yet sustained entirely. We live out our singularity along with olive and almond trees, oleanders, tarmac, huge trucks, until size becomes irrelevant. Smoke, blue, coastal range, stem of dry grass, brittle eucalyptus leaf, pebble ground into the ground. Each bears love's print, is held particular within the universe. Even the small, soft moth on the window of the rest area's dingy washroom, unaware of our scrutiny. Its russet wings, traced with intricacies of gray, owns an intrinsic excellence.
In whom all things hold together, in whom all things hold together.
I have one last song before we break, and I'll just get to it. Well, I wanted to say actually one more thing about Adamah and Eve, just to tie it up. Adamah does mean of the earth. Human is connected to humus. And I was really hoping that hubris had something to do with removing ourselves. And it does actually have a root in up, out. And I'm not sure if that's connected to up, out of the earth or not, but it very well might. And Eve means to live, to breathe, or living and breathing. And so if you look at them in a ternary symbolic way, our original ancestors, it's a pretty beautiful symbol for us to rest in this place. We are very restless, and a part of that is our longing for God, but I also think a part of it is the philosophy that we're not from here, and so it's just working with that paradox. So.
Sandals fashioned from the hides of the ancestors of the flocks we watch tonight. The breath for their mouths is the breath from our mouths, and the grasses they graze grow from what has died. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Stars impart a mystery, sending messages of dignity, that creation teems with life, and I am is in that life, and the voices of the angels sing glory. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Born of flesh in that stable is a sign, and he will spread his arms to embody all of life, and sink down, down in the soil, and die like a seed, to show love spin in every vein that ever flowed. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Fear not, fear not, Adamah of the earth. Birth and death are one. We return to dust, so the grass will grow. Feed